Well, first, I'd really like to thank David and Bill and Peter and others that are responsible for giving me this opportunity and bringing me to Cleveland. It's good to kind of step away a little bit from my day job, which is a pretty all-consuming one. And while I will be talking about some of my work at the World Bank, I'm really not wearing that official hat today. I'm here speaking and hopefully offering a word of encouragement and inspiration and maybe a little challenge about ways in which you can further mobilize hope here in Cleveland and beyond. I have to admit that sometimes the Baptist preacher in me gets the better of me, so I didn't come to preach, but sometimes that can take over. But I really want to leave some time for some dialogue. This is not meant to just be a monologue. I really hope that some of the things that I raise we can actually talk about in a little bit of Q&A time. I am really an admirer of the mission of the Community West Foundation. You just heard it mentioned, but you are advancing the health and well-being of people across the city of Cleveland. And you won't be surprised that I'm a big fan of your kind of little motto of illuminating hope. And in many ways, when I did a little research about your foundation, I was really moved and impressed by the ways in which you are embodying Christ's mandate and call in Matthew 25, where he asks and requires of us when we see the naked to give them clothing, when we see the homeless to give them shelter, when we see the hungry to give them food. Just as you did to the least of these, my brethren, you also did for me. And that work is extremely important and extremely necessary. I am going to speak from my own Christian faith perspective and tradition, but I really hope that my message will resonate to all of you, whether you're a person of faith or whether you're more of a person of conscience. And I really hope that what I share today can enable you to redouble your efforts and strengthen your commitment to the great work that's already being done. I do want to tag a title onto this message. And the shorter version is Mobilizing Hope, but the second part is 5 smooth stones for ending poverty in our midst. 5 smooth stones for ending poverty in our midst. How many of you have been to Washington, D.C. over the last 3 years? So quite a few of you. Now, out of all of you that have come to the nation's capital, how many of you had a chance to visit the new Dr. King Memorial that is, okay, so fewer number. I'm going to talk to all the people that didn't raise their hand the second time after this is over. But I highly encourage anyone that does make it to the nation's capital to come and make a priority of visiting the Dr. King's Memorial. It's only been around for just a few years, and I'm particularly proud because my fraternity played a major role in seeding the idea for the very creation of that memorial. Dr. King was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And I had a chance to go to the dedication ceremony that took place a little over 2 years ago, when my now oldest son, Joshua, was just 1 year old, and I was holding Joshua at this beautiful, brilliant day when this incredible memorial was being dedicated. And during that dedication ceremony, Dr. King's son, Martin Luther King Jr. III, really challenged all of us. He said to the crowd that we should never replace the brand of Dr. King with his core beliefs, and that we can never let the idol of Dr. King blind us to his ideals. And then his daughter went on to share how she felt it was providential timing, that the timing of that memorial, that dedication service got delayed because of Hurricane Irene at the time. And while it was supposed to take place on the anniversary of the March on Washington, it took place a couple of months later. And while she felt that was particularly important, was because so often we as a country have a tendency to freeze frame Dr. King in the I Have a Dream speech. And as important and as monumental as that speech was, it so often leads us to forget the totality of what Dr. King stood for. To remember that Dr. King was tragically cut down by a bullet while supporting sanitation workers in Memphis who were fighting for a living wage in 1968. Dr. King and so many of the leaders of the civil rights movement understood that the unfinished business of that movement had to go far beyond civil rights and tackle the inequalities of economic injustice. And they were planning a Poor People's Campaign in March that Dr. King never got to participate in. And part of the reason why I think that is so crucial is that we have inherited, particularly my generation has inherited, so much of that unfinished business. Dr. King said a quote that was in a sermon in a book that you can find called Strength of Love that unfortunately did not make the list of 16 quotes that's on the granite wall behind the King Memorial itself. Now, they didn't consult me. I'm not really sure why, but I didn't get to help influence what quotes made that list. But in that sermon, he said this, which really became the focal quote for the book that I wrote a couple years ago. Dr. King said, "The saving of our world from pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority." Now, it's a mouthful, but what I love about his words are these concepts and this call to be creatively maladjusted to the conditions and the injustice that you see around you, and to be a transformed nonconformist, to be actively committed to changing those conditions around you and not to accept the status quo. And I think that's the very power of what our faith and our conscience can bring to social change. Now, I don't know about you, but I actually felt that I was born in the wrong era. I'm a little older than I probably look, but I was born in 1976. And Dr. King's legacy certainly inspired a great deal of my life. But I was born very much in the shadow of the civil rights struggle. And while it may seem strange to some of you, I'd kind of wished that I'd been born 20 or 30 years earlier because I felt that the civil rights struggle was the zenith of civic activism. And as hard as that struggle was, I felt a little frustration and even exasperation at times that my generation, Generation X, had taken for granted many of the struggles that came before us. We were growing up in the crossfire between the unfinished business of the civil rights movement and so much of the cultural backlash that was taking place, some of which was driven by the religious right during the 1980s. And in many respects, our generation got written off as being overly self-indulgent and apathetic. And there certainly is some truth to that. But what I experienced, what I saw when I was in high school, when I was in college, is that my generation was replacing civic activism with community service. We wanted to make a difference in our world, but we were relatively cynical about political change as a vehicle for doing so. And with service, we could see the impact more directly. And another major reason is that injustice became kind of a mutated gene that was much more covert and institutionalized. In some ways, it felt easier to name Jim Crow segregation as a system that needed to be dismantled. And yet, poverty that was hurting so many communities across the country and continues to hurt this very community of Cleveland was much more difficult to address. And yet I knew that there had to be more that we could do to address some of that unfinished work of economic injustice. I've come to realize that God did create me for the right moment and for the right season, and I have worked to try to develop and identify what are some of those new wineskins that are necessary in order to address some of this unfinished business. And I really want to offer some of my experiences and thoughts in that regard. But when we look out at the landscape of the human condition in the United States, in Cleveland, and even around the world, I believe that Dr. King would probably be turning in his grave based on the ways in which so much of his dream has become deferred, his dream of a beloved community. When more than 1 in 5 children in this nation grow up in the quicksands of poverty, Dr. King's dream is being deferred. And that statistic is particularly harsh and acute here in Cleveland, where, as you probably know, you have the 3rd highest concentration of children living in poverty out of any city in this country. 53%, or 47,000 children, at least in 2012, are living and growing up in the quicksands of poverty. Dr. King's dream is deferred when only about half of Latino and African American students graduate from high school, compared to 78% of whites. His dream is deferred when black wealth, on average, is 1/10 less than your average white family wealth. The disparity is still quite extreme. His dream is deferred when 1 out of every 3 African American men in this country are currently under the control, in some shape or form of the criminal justice system. They're either on parole or they're behind bars. And when we look out a little bit more broadly, and this ties more into my work at the World Bank today, Dr. King's dream is deferred when over 2 billion people across the world live on less than $2 a day in conditions that many of us would associate with abject and dehumanizing poverty. Or when we think about how 8 million children die of preventable disease and malnutrition every single year, or that 20 million people today are in some form of modern-day slavery, more people than were enslaved at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I can rattle off many statistics, and unfortunately, statistics can have a way of paralyzing us, of overwhelming us, and that's why the power of mobilizing hope is so crucial. One of the most urgent questions that face us today is how do we generate the same degree of urgency around many of these statistics that so often seem intractable. And I've come to understand that so often crises like poverty take on the persona of Goliath. Many of you probably know and can remember the story of David and Goliath. It happens to be my favorite story from the Old Testament. And I had a professor at the Kennedy School of Government who teaches community organizing named Marshall Gantz, who was quite involved in the farm workers movement and the civil rights movement, who really helped me to understand and to see this story through a new lens. If you remember the story, there's a moment where David, probably 16 years old, at least that's what biblical scholars estimate, skinny, relatively, probably skinnier than I am, is given a coat of armor and a mighty sword by King Saul because he agrees to take on the mighty Philistine in battle. Now, Goliath had been challenging the Israelites every single morning at dawn, mocking God in the process, and not a single Israelite was willing to meet him in battle. And at first, David is going to take these conventional weapons, but he realizes that they are useless to him. And he uses his sanctified imagination to reconfigure the battlefield. And he remembers how God enabled him to overcome a bear with a single slingshot and a stone. And you know how the story ends. He finds 5 smooth stones in a brook, and he uses one of those stones to knock down the mighty Philistine, and then he cuts his head off with a sword. And what I love about this moment in the story is that David is able to reconfigure the battlefield according to the unique gifts that God has given him. If he had tried to take on Goliath with the conventional weapon, it would have been a very different end to the story. But he uses his imagination and his creativity to identify those unique gifts and stones that God had given him in that moment. And I believe that God has given us, He's given your organizations, many of those same stones. That you possess many of the same stones that are necessary, not just to meet immediate needs, but also to address the root causes of those needs. One of the biggest disagreements and chasms that has existed in the Christian church, but I think this is relevant in society at large, is the real debate between those who are partisans of the social gospel. In other words, that following Christ or being a person of faith is really about putting your faith into action and addressing social issues, being proponents of social justice. And those that have been proponents more of a personalized gospel that emphasizes salvation and personal piety. And the reality is that both are so necessary. And there's been this false division, this false choice between charity and between justice. And I came by Cleveland to share with you the good news that charity and justice actually need each other. They are mutually reinforcing. Because charity without a commitment to justice can be well-intentioned, but can sometimes only be a palliative and not a real cure. At worst, it can even lead to forms of dependency. But on the flip side, justice without a commitment to charity can often be overly misguided and self-righteous. I've seen many an advocate, even in Washington, D.C., which is kind of the epicenter of lobbying and advocacy, who are committed to various causes, but have almost no relationship with the very people that they're supposed to be representing or they're supposed to be advocating on behalf of. Charity and justice need each other, and that's exactly what our faith does. It combines them together. my favorite text that does this in such a poetic way is Isaiah 58, where the prophet Isaiah criticizes Jews at the time for just going through the motions of religion. He literally kind of challenges them based on their counterfeit religion. And he says, "Is not this the fasting that God desires, but to feed the hungry and to break the yokes of injustice?" And then he goes on to say, after we feed the hungry and after we break the yokes of injustice, then our light will shine like a noonday. We will become known as repairers of the breach, restorer of streets with dwellings. What an amazing image, to be repairers of the breach, restorers of streets with dwellings here in Western Cleveland and in your surrounding areas. And what I love about this text is it really creates this holy union between charity and justice, between service and activism, that we don't have to choose between them. Now, you may think that I came by to try to revamp or overhaul the mission of the Community West Foundation. And I want to be very clear that I deeply respect the work that all of your organizations and your grantees are doing to meet immediate needs. And I know that many of you are already involved in some policy work and in some advocacy work. But I would encourage you to go deeper, to really better understand the mutually reinforcing relationship between charity and justice, and to not see politics as a spectator sport. While there's many reasons, legitimate ones, to be cynical about our politics, it has become a vicious cycle, an epidemic within our body politic. And the more that continues, I think the worse it's going to get. I've been involved in countless lobbying meetings across Congress, mainly on issues of economic justice. And I have seen firsthand that the most persuasive and the most credible advocates are not the paid lobbyists. They are the very people in this room. They're the service providers who come alongside people that are disinherited and that are disadvantaged and really can speak to the very struggles they're facing, both offering a word of hope, but also a word of struggle. And it's your voices that are so crucial and that I think could be the game changers. I saw a direct example of this in 2005 when I was working at Sojourners. And at that moment, Congress was threatening to make very severe, I would even say draconian cuts to food stamps and to a number of other programs that benefit the most vulnerable. And there was a big debate in Congress about how to balance the budget, which was necessary. But again, there were a lot of questions about whether that had to be done by reducing funding for programs that benefit the most vulnerable in our midst. And I was a part of organizing a peaceful demonstration on the steps of the Capitol, where the majority of the people there were ministers and service providers from all around the country who poured into Washington, D.C. to represent the voices of those who couldn't necessarily travel there themselves, who were the very beneficiaries of these programs. And the very witness of people of faith and of service providers speaking together and standing together, praying together, really helped to change the hearts and the attitudes of many members on both sides of the aisle. And over time, we were successful in pushing back some of those cuts. And I can share certainly other examples where I think faith has been a decisive factor in protecting the poor, even in the last number of years. But I want to close by sharing with you 5 smooth stones that I think would enable your organizations and would enable the Community West Foundation to deepen its commitment to connecting justice and charity together, and in the process, having more impact on the lives of those that are struggling and that are disinherited across Cleveland and beyond. The first stone that I want to emphasize is a notion that I learned about when I was in Haiti. It's a term that was coined by Dr. Paul Farmer, who co-founded Partners in Health. It is a health and human rights organization that operates a clinic in one of the most impoverished regions of the Western Hemisphere, literally in the central plateau of Haiti. And it was co-founded by the current president of the World Bank, Jim Kim. It's pretty remarkable in my mind that the World Bank currently has a president who is a physician and a cultural anthropologist. Not exactly your typical resume for a World Bank president. And he comes out of a set of experiences where he became inspired by working with Catholic lay communities. And the very mission of Partners in Health is to show a preferential option for the poor. Well, they coined this idea, this term, pragmatic solidarity, because they believed that they were called to show a common or demonstrate a common cause with those in need and offer goods and services that can diminish their hardship. And I believe that this understanding of pragmatic solidarity is so tied into what all of you do, that you create opportunities for people to better connect to the real lives of people that are struggling with hunger, with homelessness, that you help to humanize their stories. I came to a much deeper understanding of what pragmatic solidarity was all about when I had a chance to spend some time in South Africa in 2000. And I was doing some work around the crisis of HIV, which was a catastrophic epidemic at that point. About 30% of the adult population in South Africa were living with HIV and literally faced a death sentence. The disease was surrounded in a conspiracy of silence and of stigma and shame. And at that time, an organization was created called the Treatment Action Campaign. And they literally were inspired by the example of the Danish king during the time of World War II, of Nazi occupation, who literally wore the Star of David and inspired the rest of his population, the probably Christian population, to wear the Star of David as well, so that the Nazis could not tell the difference between a Jew and a Christian. What TAC, or Treatment Action Campaign, ended up doing, inspired by that story, is wearing these t-shirts with the word HIV positive brightly emblazoned on the t-shirt itself. And you had people that were living with HIV, but mostly who were not living with HIV, but understood that if one person is infected, then all people are affected by this disease. And by wearing those t-shirts, they were showing pragmatic solidarity with people that were living with HIV, and they started to tear down the walls of stigma in the process. And we have seen remarkable gains in the fight against HIV, now to the point where, because of the success of activism that I can certainly talk about more later, we are on the precipice of being able to realize an AIDS-free generation across the world. So this idea of pragmatic solidarity is so crucial for the work that we do together. And it strikes me again that your organizations provide bridges and vehicles for enabling people to demonstrate pragmatic solidarity with people in need. The second stone that I want to mention is one that is a familiar one and an ancient one, and it's the very ethic of the Golden Rule. But I want to describe it in a slightly different way. Unfortunately, the ethic of rugged individualism, which is very much ingrained in the American ethos and psyche, has too often been gone astray and is more synonymous with hedonism and narcissism in our culture than its original meaning, which was all about the ideals of mobility and freedom and security and dignity for all. Instead, too often, it feels like our society is caught in a game of survivor, where we look at people's situation through the lens of the survival of the fittest. And we forget the power of the Golden Rule, that the Golden Rule requires of us to break out of our comfort zones, to not walk over and ignore those who have been bruised and battered on the Jericho roads of our neighborhoods and streets, but instead to go out of our way to try to help them. And again, I admire all of the work you're doing along those lines. But I learned about another kind of dimension of the Golden Rule, again, when I was in South Africa, where I came to understand the concept of Ubuntu, which is a concept deeply ingrained within South African culture. And Ubuntu simply means I am because we are. It is a belief in our interdependence and our mutuality. And I believe that it provides an even kind of deeper understanding of what the Golden Rule is all about. I would argue that fostering and inculcating the Golden Rule now is more needed than ever, because so often we have become more and more segregated from each other. There's a professor at Harvard named Michael Sandel who created this term that I love called the skyboxification of America. And what he's traced through evidence and data is that increasingly across the country, our interactions with people different than ourselves, particularly of a different socioeconomic status, have become shrunk considerably over the last 20 to 30 years. And he epitomizes this with the idea of the skybox. I've never been to where the Indians play, but I would imagine there's a skybox in that baseball stadium. And whereas before, baseball games were kind of the great equalizer because everyone was kind of sitting in the stands and it wasn't that big of a difference between the best seat price and some of the cheap seat prices. Now you have the wealthiest fans watching the game in their skybox, completely separated from many others who may not be able to afford those expensive tickets. It's just one small example of a trend that I think is multiplied across many of our interactions in our daily life. And so truly modeling the golden rule requires us to try to break out of those comfort zones and encourage others to do the same. The third stone that I want to mention is the stone of what I would call a jubilee ethic for our economy. There is a trend that I think has been the dominant operating system of our economy, which has been very tied to a sense of market fundamentalism, which is a catch-all term that describes the overdependence on the market to govern and solve societal ills. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe in the power of the market to allocate goods and services efficiently and in fostering innovation and entrepreneurship. But so much of what drove the Great Collapse and the economic crisis a number of years ago was the brokenness of that very market. Because I think we've lost sight of an ethic that could help counterbalance some of the excessive risk-taking and speculation and profit-making that we saw drove the economic crisis or was behind the economic crisis. In the book of Leviticus, God calls for a jubilee year, that every 50 years there'd be a super jubilee year where debts would be forgiven, where land would be laid fallow, where slaves would be set free. And that ethic was necessary because there was a belief that based on human nature, there would be an inexorable concentration of wealth and of power in the hands of too few, often at the expense of the many. And that this commitment to Jubilee was meant to be a counterweight to that. Now, it's kind of hard to imagine literally implementing a Jubilee year. As much as many of us would like our debts completely written off and set free, wouldn't be very popular in Wall Street. But I think that this ethic is extremely important because as service providers, as people of faith, our very definition of how we measure the economy is not just about economic growth. It is about how the weak and the vulnerable are faring among us, whether that very growth is benefiting them. And the good news is that even in an institution like the World Bank that has been known and kind of had a fixation on economic growth, our real focus now is on what we call inclusive growth. It's about what we call boosting shared prosperity. And we are very determined to ensure that economic growth, which is a necessary condition for reducing poverty, does so because it doesn't happen automatically. And there's a great deal of work that's being done in that regard. It's inspiring to me that the current World Bank president, Jim Kim, wrote a book in the late 1990s called Dying for Growth, where he literally took on many of the policies that were so often fixated on growth that ignored many of the investments that were absolutely crucial in human needs, whether that's in education or health, that so often spur economic growth in the first place. And so there's a great deal of work that's being done now in order to accelerate that progress. Many people don't know that between 1990 and 2010, the world managed to cut in half the number of people that were living in extreme poverty, which by the UN definition is people living under $1.25 a day. It's a pretty low threshold, but it's a really important one. And we, as a world, have managed to cut that number in half, literally lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And that was done both because of robust economic growth, but also because of smart programs to provide greater economic opportunity and to redistribute wealth in ways that enabled people to lift themselves out of poverty. So this ethic of Jubilee, I think, is important. The fourth stone is one that's particularly timely right now, particularly in light of the controversy and pain that it has been sparked by the shooting and killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. I know that this case has triggered a great deal of pain and of debate in this country about the state of racial profiling and the state of the racism in our nation. And I would argue that it is time for us to have more of a true awakening around the modern day manifestations of racism. and understand the ways in which racism is still so institutionalized and entrenched in our country. I remember back when President Obama was first elected, there were many people that kind of bandied the term a post-racial America, which I never quite understood. I didn't know if that meant that racism was now obsolete and that race no longer mattered or something else. But the danger in that aspiration is that I actually think that is the wrong goal. That as we approach this new reality, that by the year 2040, demographers estimate that racial minorities will be in the majority in this country. And we can either start preparing for that now with a degree of excitement and anticipation, or we can continue to be stuck in some of our current unease and trepidation around what that will mean for us. And to create this preferred reality, we need to re-embrace King's understanding of the beloved community, which for me requires creating a nation where neither privilege nor punishment is viciously tied to race or ethnicity, where a young black man isn't presumed to be guilty instead of being presumed to be innocent. And again, I mean, I know that there's many of us that don't want to prejudge what happened because none of us have the details. But I think we should be deeply disturbed by even the information we do have and understand why there's so much pain in Ferguson and in many other parts of the country that is being driven by so many experiences of racial profiling and of being devalued and dismissed, not just by the police, but by other authorities as well. Being able to embrace this vision of a beloved community requires real reconciliation, but it requires justice as well. And many of your organizations literally can provide some of the balm and the bridges for enabling that healing and that reconciliation to happen. I want to kind of end where I started, which is with the fifth smooth stone, and it is the power of hope. I chose to title my book Mobilizing Hope for a reason, because I believe that hope is the very oxygen of social change. I have been a student and somewhat of a scholar of the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement, and of a number of other movements that have transformed our politics. And in each and every case, hope was literally that oxygen that enabled people to see a different reality. They had an air of inevitability about their activism, that somehow, some way, systems of injustice could be transformed and dismantled. There's a critical role for hope because ultimately so many people, particularly in need, are dealing not just with their physical condition, but they're dealing with many spiritual conditions as well. The World Bank came out with a study in 2000 where we interviewed 60,000 people that are living in poverty across the world. And it was kind of a seminal work. It was called Voices of the Poor. And we asked them what their lives were like and what were the biggest obstacles they faced to getting out of poverty. And some of the fairly natural things came out, like dealing with hunger and the pain of hunger, not having access to education, etc. But even more prominent than those things, people talked about the experience of feeling humiliated, feeling stigmatized, feeling as though they didn't have any real agency or power. And those are not simply addressed or cured by material things. They also require a real restoration of hope and of dignity. They require helping people heal, helping to give them a sense of their own agency and their own power. And that's why I believe and have seen why hope is so crucial. So this idea of hope is absolutely essential to the work that all of you do. And I think that mobilizing hope is probably one of the most crucial things we could do in order to help transform our broken politics. And it's one of the most powerful antidotes we have to cynicism. I want to close with a quote, and it's actually a proverb. It's not from the book of Proverbs, but it's an Ethiopian proverb. And it says, when spider webs unite, they can entangle a lion. Just think about that. A web with all of its individual strands are very weak. But when they form a web, they can entangle things that are so much more powerful than themselves. And when you think about it, poverty in our midst, here in Cleveland, is devouring the dreams of far too many children. It is dashing the hopes and denying the potential of far too many children and adults. But I believe that the web is in this room, that foundations and service providers and faith leaders literally provide and can form that web that can entangle a line as formidable as poverty. And my hope is that as you leave this meeting, at least some of these stones may be of use to you. I bet you many of them are familiar. You may call them something slightly different, but you're probably using these stones in many different ways in your work. But I pray that you could leave this place having picked up the stone of pragmatic solidarity that enables us to show real acts of solidarity with those that are in need. That you would pick up the stone of the golden rule and even deepen that commitment in your understanding of Ubuntu, that when one part of God's body suffers, then all parts suffer with it. That you would bring a Jubilee ethic to our economy, not just the national economy, but the local economy, and help to unleash and tap into the hidden assets that exist already in the communities in which you work. That you would make a greater commitment to promote racial reconciliation and justice, even as hard as those conversations are, and even if it requires you to break out of your comfort zones. And that you would become what Desmond Tutu describes as a prisoner of hope, because it's the very oxygen of social change. I hope that this web grows stronger, and I'm grateful for the work of the Community West Foundation in helping to not just financially support that web, but to support it in so many other ways as well. Thank you.